Hey, and welcome back to the History of Russia podcast. This is episode 7, Holmgard. Now, before we get started this week, I just wanted to thank Penny Out for the kind review on iTunes. I really do enjoy reading your feedback, and it means a lot to me that people are enjoying my efforts. Now, Holmgard, sometimes seen written as Holmgarten, but better known as Veliki Novgorod, first comes into the historical record in the year 862, and this is via the Novgorod First Chronicle. Now, this isn't to be confused with the later Primary Chronicle, and the document is dated from sometime in the mid-11th century. In all probability, and given its strategic location on Lake Ilmen, it wasn't the first major settlement in the area. Trade, and specifically amber, had been taken from this area for millennia, and it found itself right on what historians would later dub the Amber Road, which is an ancient trading route linking the Baltic to Mediterranean seas. Amber from the region would eventually find itself traded as far as the Iberian Peninsula, to the Phoenician coasts, and to the courts of ancient Egypt. It's likely that this strategic location is what made the location of Holmgard such a desirable location for its future inhabitants. For the sake of continuity, I'm going to refer to the city from this point onwards as Novgorod, not because Holmgard isn't a badass name, it totally is, but as our story develops, Novgorod is the city and the wider area will eventually become referred to. To preempt any further confusion, and to ensure you're aware of where the modern day city is, it's about 200 kilometers south of St. Petersburg and 550 kilometers to the northwest of Moscow. It should not be confused with what is now the much larger city of Nizhny Novgorod, which is over 1,000 kilometers away to the east. Novgorod just means new town in Russian, hence its popularity as a name. It's just like the multiple Newports and Newcastles we see around the English-speaking world. The foundation of the city is clouded in mystery. Despite mentions in the later Norse sagas to go with our first chronicle, which placed the foundation of the city in the same time frame, there's little to no archaeological evidence to support it. The legend, as according to the Norse sagas, is that a chieftain named Rurik and his two brothers, Sinjus and Thruvor, first asserted Norse dominance in the area over a town named Ladoga on what is now Lake Ladoga to the east of modern-day St. Petersburg. Amazingly, the archaeological evidence totally corroborates this version of events, with objects and house shapes and sizes confirming to Slavic and Finno-Ugric standards from the mid-8th century, before then changing to designs more in common with those found on the Jutland Peninsula in what is now Denmark from the mid-9th century. Even more astoundingly, multiple historical records possibly also validate the existence of Rurik. But before we get too carried away, this is only to the same level of certainty that we have with the likes of, say, Ragnar Lodbrok. It's not definitive, but it does seem likely that our Rurik was known as Rurik of Dorstad to the Franks and Frisians, and was, by the 850s, the nephew of a powerful Danish king. He also owned lands in Frisia, i.e. the modern Netherlands, which were granted to him by Louis I of Francia. However, by 860, Rurik had reneged on his agreements with the Franks and had recommenced raiding, even looting the city of Bremen. And then being stripped of his lands as a result of this in Frisia, he returned back to his homeland of Denmark, only to find that it had been laid waste by his political enemies back home. It does seem a happy coincidence that he should then appear in sources, at least in the east, only 2 years later. Unfortunately, what the sources don't tell us is how Rurik came to be in Ladoga, how he assumed control of the city, and how he kept his control. Historians are falling over themselves to either suggest violent conquest, peaceful cooperation with the natives, with the Norse as a ruling class, or, and I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, that Rurik was actually a Slav. Rather than being local to the area, he was actually from an area to the southeast of Denmark, which would go some way to support the archaeological findings and the shift in architecture. And as the likes of Mikhailovich and Stepin Kamensky point out, it supports the lack of Norse influence on modern Russian in terms of a language, which isn't to say it isn't there, it's not at the same level as Norse's influence modern English. But also keep in mind that this could be due to linguistical reasons. Old English is much closer to Norse than Norse is to Old Russian, for instance. From what I can ascertain, and remember I'm no scholar, we'll never know his origins. I'm going to go with him being Norse, if only because of, as the Byzantines would later call them, the Varangian trading expeditions to Constantinople from at least 830, which is a full 3 decades before the time frame that we're talking about here. Now back to how Rurik got control over the city. The primary chronicle, which remember is not a primary source, so it has to be taken with a grain of salt, suggests that Rurik and his brothers were actually invited by the chieftains of the area to take control and rule on their behalf, potentially as a means of settling disputes and resolving conflict amongst them as to who should rule. When first reading this, I thought it was a bit far-fetched, but having given it some thought, I don't know if it actually is. Could Rurik have had some tenuous claims to the throne to the area by marriage? Was it really that far-fetched that William the Bastard found himself promised the King of England only 2 centuries afterwards? And if not for Harold and Harold contesting that claim, he may well have secured the throne without bloodshed. I'm only speculating, but it remains a possibility. However it was that Rurik came to power, it appears that only a number of years before settling up in Ladoga, he relocated to the larger and more trafficked Novgorod. Just a quick side note, I've seen a number of texts refer to Ladoga, Holmgard and Veliki Novgorod as the same place, but Russian texts definitely refer to Ladoga and the other two to be distinctly different and quite a distance apart. If you can shed any light on this, please feel free to contact me. The relocation to Novgorod would see his power and influence grow, eventually necessitating needing to send Sinuus to rule in his stead to the far northeast in Belozersk, which is almost 1,000 kilometers away, whilst Thruvor ruled Pskov, which is a much more manageable 200 kilometer ride away. Given the vast size of the areas involved here, it's no wonder Rurik sent his brothers to rule in his stead, given these distant locations, where word could take weeks, and in the bleaker months, literally months to travel. However, it appears that both brothers would soon die, without issue, leaving Rurik to rule alone, which he would do for another decade before finally passing himself. No record of his cause of death, unfortunately, is found, but given he may well have been to his 50s, possibly even his 60s at this point, on the assumption that he was 20 when he was terrorising Louis back in Francia, it's not unreasonable to assume it was one of natural causes. He left a single son, Igor, who was too young to rule in his own right. Now, thanks again for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, I would love to read your feedback. If you can spare the time, I would greatly appreciate it if you could leave me a review on iTunes, as this is really the best place to allow others to pick up on the show. Now, as you're probably aware, today isn't a Sunday, the day of release, but there's a new episode. The reason for this is that I'm away on holiday this coming weekend, and then the following weekend I have the in-laws over from Italy for a week. As a result, I didn't want to leave it almost 2 weeks without an episode, so I'm giving you 2 shorter ones to fill that void. I hope you join me next week. We'll be looking at events further south, again in the same time period of the 860s, as we're now at a point where there's events and characters to actually cover. We'll be entering a timeline, and as a result, instead of covering peoples and huge swaths of that time in an episode, things will now be really narrowed down and nuanced. Again, if you'd like to leave me any feedback, or if you'd like to get in touch, please email the russianhistorypodcast@gmail.com, and again, if you could leave a review on iTunes, that would be greatly appreciated. Thanks again, ta-ra for now.